In Darlington in 2008, a team of enthusiasts is building the first brand new British steam locomotive from scratch in nearly 50 years. It's a multi-million-pound endeavour that started nearly 20 years ago. Though the project is unique, the enthusiasm is not. Steam engines still have a huge and passionate following all over Britain.
When you're near a steam locomotive, there's an almost elemental force at work. You can feel every single aspect of that machine's working. It's passionate, it's theatrical, it's dirty, noisy, powerful. It's heavy metal in motion.
It's a combination of noise and atmosphere and vast sort of cranking engines and colour and coal and fire. I just think it's the most wonderful thing on earth.
Most of us think of steam trains as museum pieces. A Victorian technology, dirty, incredibly inefficient and dangerous. But as late as 1968, scheduled steam services still ran on British railways. After World War II, most European countries switched to diesel and electric-powered trains. Britain chose to stick with steam power. Thousands of new steam locomotives were built, a quixotic enterprise doomed to failure.
The steam engine had been around for 150 years. It had done its job. The world had moved on. The day of the diesel and the electric train had come, and steam had to die.
Other countries left steam behind long ago. Why did Britain persist? And why do we still find it so hard to let go of steam? The origins of Britain's post-war obsession with steam lie in the decision to build over 2,500 brand new locomotives between 1948 and 1960. This was in stark contrast to many European countries, which chose to leave Victorian-designed steam power behind.
You look at the railways of Italy, France and Germany, which were not entirely destroyed, but certainly in Germany 70% of the bridges were blown up. Quite a lot of the railways were completely destroyed. And particularly in France, they said, right, we are going to now, as fast as we possibly can, build a new railway. And when they built their new railway, they said, well, right, we don't want steam anymore, we are going to electrify.
The destruction of Allied Europe's railways meant they had to be rebuilt from scratch. Our railways hadn't been destroyed outright. It was possible to patch them up and keep them running with steam. The finances for a complete overhaul were not yet available.
There were investment shortages across the whole of the UK economy. And railways were not top of the agenda, quite rightly. There was a National Health Service to fund. There were houses to build. There was a huge housing shortage. There was a steel industry to revive. There were tremendous investment challenges.
The railways may not have been Britain's top priority, but their central role in the war effort had been crucial to victory.
The use of the railways during the war was a critical element, because railways were not only operating at volumes that were much higher than in peacetime, but there was no time to maintain the railways. Indeed, it was quite dangerous times to try and maintain the railways.
The non-stop journey from Holland to home was made possible by the military authorities and the British Railways. Red tape was cut and the green light showed all...
Well, the Second World War left the four big private companies completely bankrupt. As far as their infrastructure was concerned, pretty much smashed up as well. Really, that's why British Railways came into being, because the war had rendered the railways almost inoperable as a private source of income to a certain extent.
Most of Europe had operated nationalised railways before World War II. Britain had run four big private railway companies: the London and North Eastern Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the Southern Railway and the Great Western Railway.
We had the combined railway system with 4 major companies, heavily regulated, providing railway services. They were utilities, they weren't particularly profitable, and they were largely taken for granted.
The 4 big railway companies had struggled even before the war. When the Labour government swept into power in 1945, they promised to invest in the railways. Nationalisation was on the agenda.
World War, and the private sector, quite frankly, I think, was going to find it hard to carry on. So when the government, as part of its nationalisation programme, offered the railways the possibility of compensation, the owners snatched their hands off, actually.
The 1st of January 1948 ushered in a period of new hope. The 4 great railway companies were brought together into one single new organisation: British Railways.
It's just a few minutes before midnight, and in very soon the signalman here will signal in the last Great Western Railway train to pass through Reading.
On day one of British Railways, everyone was thinking, we've got a bright future, we're going to modernise, we're going to be a shining example of a modern passenger transport system.
With the passing of the old year, the principal railways of Great Britain, London Transport, came under public ownership. So the first big stride was taken towards establishing in this country a publicly owned transport system under unified management. The vesting of the 4 mainline railway companies and more than 50 others in the British Transport Commission is indeed an historic occasion.
You can imagine the scene midnight on the 31st of December. In many people's eyes become owned by the people. Whistles were let off, no doubt, caps were thrown into the air and this sort of thing. Very theatrical moment, a moment I think of real enthusiasm amongst great swathes of the population. The railways had become British Railways, the People's Railway.
But officially, the Great Western Railway is dead, and to many, undoubtedly, the late lamented.
The assets they inherited were absolutely massive. They inherited everything that was within the control of the former railway companies. So that was not only the infrastructure, which they owned, the track, the signalling, all the locomotives, a very large number, and we're talking about tens of thousands of wagons, were just not fit for purpose. What also came into the railway operations was shipping, hotels, and well over 1 million people.
British Railways were starting a new chapter, and so were the British people. Travel restrictions were lifted, and people took the opportunity to journey around their country again, looking for some light relief.
After the war, people responded to the new freedom to travel. Firstly, through more and more people going away on holiday to a resort, the archetypal fortnight in Hastings or Brighton or wherever it was, but also through the excursion. Both of those were responses to people's desire to get around, and there's no doubt about it, people started to travel again, big time.
The mounting pressure on the world's oldest rail system got engineers and managers thinking about the future. The question of steam's continuing place on our railways had to be addressed.
The steam locomotive had been a very successful technology for Britain's railways. But even in the 1930s, there had been discussions about how great a future, how long a future steam traction had. After the Second World War, the debate started again. What sort of traction should be used?
Leading British Railways' search for a new type of locomotive was their chief engineer, Robin Riddles, who had 3 options to look at: traditional coal-powered steam, electric or diesel. Electric trains had been successfully run in parts of southern England since the turn of the century. They seemed a logical replacement for steam.
Electric was superior. It is superior, it was superior, but it cost more. Robin Riddles was, in fact, in favour of electrification, which was ruled out because of investment shortages after the war. We were in the middle of the austerity period.
Electrification required miles and miles of costly overhead lines. Diesel power was more straightforward. Yet the first diesel trains to run on main lines in 1948 proved very unreliable. However, the real argument against using diesel power at the time came down to energy supplies.
Diesel tractors certainly relied on oil, and there were some people who argued that we didn't have any oil. Of course, nobody knew about North Sea oil in those days, and that it would be very foolish to turn the railways over to an oil-based form of traction, diesel.
It was felt that coal was an indigenous fuel from this country, oil wasn't, and therefore we should use coal, we should use it to continue with steam locomotives as long as possible, and eventually convert the mainline railways to electricity, again using electricity produced from burning coal.
Steam was the proven technology. Everybody knew how a steam locomotive worked, how it could be used most effectively, and above all, steam traction was cheap. It was cheap to build anyway. It didn't cost very much to construct a locomotive.
Britain was not yet ready for the expensive switch to electric or diesel. Steam power was cheap and coal was plentiful. But the decision to stick with steam at this time may have been built on more than just practicalities. It may have been influenced by personal agendas.
I'm not sure that it was the right decision. Robin Riddles was a frustrated steam locomotive designer and couldn't wait to actually get in there and design his own locomotives.
For many of the people working in BR, it was hard to imagine a railway without steam. Beginning more than a century ago, it had helped to make Britain strong. For many who had grown up with it, steam was the railways.
The train was the first sign of modernisation, predating the car, of course. A steam train went to every corner of the country. They were the first thing that knitted Britain together. Everything about the railway was modern. It was new. We really can't understand what it was like to live in a predominantly rural society when these great iron horses were crashing through, saying to people, this is the future, you've got to get used to us.
The engines themselves became cultural phenomena, heroic machines designed with fearful symmetry. Some famous engines became household names, the Flying Scotsman and Mallard, the fastest steam locomotive of all time. British Railways' decision to stick with steam after World War II meant that new locomotives had to be built in places like Darlington Sheds, one of the oldest railway workshops in the world.
Some seats, please.
Right, you're okay. You can come down.
60 years after nationalisation, a new locomotive called Tornado is nearing completion. It's known as an A1 class, and it's cost £3 million to build.
This is a 160-ton, 90-mile-an-hour steam locomotive capable of developing something in the region of 2,600 horsepower. There had been 49 of them built during a period of 1948 to 49. It was the sort of engine that hauled the fastest trains from King's Cross to Newcastle and Edinburgh. The major things that they achieved compared with the pre-war engines were improvement in maintenance requirement. Easier to turn round and service, would run on less good quality coal, and would run longer between major overhauls. It would have been expected that these would have been in frontline service for 35 to 40 years, as their predecessors had been.
That's it.
The A1 class is a Pacific, and Pacific means that it's got 4 small wheels at the front, which are just carrying weight, 6 large driving wheels, and finally 2 small wheels at the back. One of the key features, which goes right the way back to Flying Scotsman in 1922, is the wide firebox, which goes right to the edge of the running plate. And on this there is 50 square feet of grate to fire. That's actually somewhat bigger than the pre-war engines, which were 41.5 square feet. The locomotive is equipped with Walchart's valve gear, which is driven through a series of rods and levers through this device here called the radius link. Now this is the essentially clever part of a steam locomotive which avoids the use of gears. And as you start moving quicker, you gradually wind this in so that by the time the engine is cruising at 70 miles an hour, you are probably only actually admitting steam into the cylinders for about 15% of the total stroke of each piston. It also explains why when engines start off they make a very loud chuffing noise, because you're admitting steam for nearly the whole of the stroke of the piston and then letting up the exhaust at not very much less than boiler pressure. But as you wind the gear back, you're only letting steam in for a short distance, which is why when they're cruising they're making more of a soft beat rather than the fierce beat that they make when they start.
Tornado is a new engine, but the design predates British Railways. Looking forwards as a single unified organisation, BR chose to develop a new class of steam locomotive for the future. Locomotive trials were set up to cherry-pick the best ideas from the big four companies.
In 2 years, designs had been produced for standard locomotives for the whole of the British railway system, and they were designed specifically to be as easy to maintain as was possible. A simple example of that is that a lot of the mainline express locomotives designed by the big four companies had 4 cylinders. You had the 2 on the outside and then you had 2 hidden inside. And maintaining the inside cylinders was actually very time consuming and quite difficult. The decision was taken very early on that all of the steam locomotives that would be produced for the unified British Railways would all be 2-cylinder locomotives. It would be possible to get to the wheels, it would be possible to get to the coupling rods and the motion. You would see, if you had pictures of the standard locomotives, that they weren't necessarily very pretty, but they were very accessible.
Over the next decade, 999 standard class engines were built, as well as more than 1,500 non-standard engines. This great variety of locomotives running on the lines gave rise to a cultural phenomenon that celebrated this diversity. Young boys all over the country started appearing at railway stations in droves to catch a glimpse of the weird and wonderful engines running on Britain's railways.
The spark that ignited the train spotting revolution was Ian Allen's ABC Guide to Southern Locomotives, which was published in 1942 when he was 15. And what it is it's a list of numbers, which doesn't sound very exciting. It's not a great read, but the point is that you take it out onto the end of the platform and you wait to tick off the engines as they come past. And it became very popular amongst teenage boys. It was the kind of iPod of its generation. Train spotting in 1942 was hip. It's unthinkable now, but it was.
During the war, Ian Allen was working for the PR department at Waterloo Station, answering letters from the public asking for information about Southern Railway's engines and carriages.
One of my chores was to deal with letters from the public asking for information related to locomotive names and numbers and principal dimensions. And it was then that I said, well, why go to all this trouble writing separate letters to people? We should do this book which would encompass the whole thing.
The book contained all of the information about Southern Railway trains that the enthusiast needed: engine classes, numbers and dimensions. The first run sold out immediately. He then published guides to the other regions. The train spotter craze took off.
There was very little else on the market, boys and girls to participate in, because there wasn't anything on during the war. Everything was on a war basis. And here was something that they could go down to the local station and watch the train.
railways did have a sort of romance attached to them. They were, in a sense, a hangover from the Great Victorian period. There was a sort of wonderful permanence about the permanent way. It was efficient. It did, on the whole, run on time. It brought everything and took everything away. The platform, the greeting, the departing, the arriving, everything about the station and the train was exciting, particularly to children. So it's not surprising that it attracted the sort of romantic attachment that train spotting represented.
Don't you like to do anything else but railways?
Yeah, there's girls and horses and yeah, there's other things, but steam engines are nice. You feel you have to have a steam engine, you know, you've got to have one every now and again. You have to go, all these chaps say the same, they've got to have a steam engine. You might better go for a fortnight without a steam engine, then you've got to go and find one somewhere, you know. That thing's got a voice up the front there, it's making a noise, it's speaking, it's a terrific noise it makes. Well, it just makes lovely noises. When it's raising steam, 90 tons of it raising steam, it sings like a kettle, and it's terrific, a lovely thing.
Train spotting was at the heart of British culture for decades. Far from being the anorak activity that its reputation now has, it was a social activity, a way for youngsters to meet. One group of young lads used to meet up in Southall in London to share their passion for the railways.
I suppose it's interesting how we all got together, we met, which was basically Southall, the railway bridge, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, the footbridge was a meeting place for us, evenings, weekends. You know, there's always...
It was a social gathering point.
Well, exactly, there was always somebody there.
I can often hear this mimicked in today's society. Well, it wouldn't have a lot to do, but in fairness, in the late 50s, early 60s, there wasn't a great deal to do. And we had to find our own fun.
Well, you'd arrive on the bike, park up your bike on the bridge, possibly stock up with frozen jubbly.
Frozen jubblies, yes.
I mean, you could see right the way down the line as far as Hanwell, so you could see trains coming well over a mile away, and there was this sort of crescendo as they approached, you know, and then the thrill of the thing going past, getting the number, seeing where it was going or what sort of train it was. It might have been a milk train, might have been a parcels or goods.
Many of the pre-war trains were still running on the main lines as well as the new standard classes. Locomotive diversity was at its height.
There was more to see than there is now. There were different kinds of locomotives. Now there are only kind of 3 or 4 of the kind of motive units that we might see. Then you'd see lots and lots of different engines. Pre-nationalisation, the coaches would have different liveries. It was easier to get to see really quite odd things. You know, you would see little tank engines doing jobs or big steam engines coming through. So there were lots more things to see.
The nation's youth celebrated the new steam age. Britain's romantic view of steam appeared to be as strong as ever.
The romance that people attached to it very rarely applied to the actual workers. And nothing illustrates the ambivalence of the British towards modernisation so much as their attitude towards a steam train. No, they wouldn't do it themselves. But yes, they wanted someone else to do it because they rather liked the romance of it.
As a teenager, Peter Gransden worked for British Railways stoking the fires on locomotives in the last years of steam.
The only light thing on the railway was the wage packet. You know, everything else was pretty hard. You know, some jobs were easy, but the majority of actually running a railway were very difficult jobs. You know, not much money and long hours. The fireman, he literally looks after the fire and also looks after the water in the boiler to making steam. And he also has to look out for the signals because the driver's on the opposite side of the bloody filthy. And like, you had no washing facilities on sheds, you had a bucket, and you fill a bucket up on the overflow from the injectors, and you get a bar of soap, and you'd have the best wash you could from then. And if you was on some turns and you were going out with your girlfriend of an evening, you get as much dirt off as you could, no, it didn't rain, because if it rained, you'd have dirty streaks all down your face, out your hair. You know, it didn't look very good, really.
As time wore on, it wasn't just the railwaymen who had had enough of the dirty Victorian technology. The general British public was starting to tire of it as well.
In the immediate years after the war, rail was the only option for long-distance travel. During the 50s, what happened was that the railways were slow, they weren't desperately keen. Most people took their holidays from Saturday to Saturday over 8 or 9 weeks in the summer. The railways actually couldn't handle the development of holidays with pay, as it became known in the early 1950s. And many people and many families' only experience of long-distance rail travel was on summer Saturdays in dirty, clapped-out coaches with trains running increasingly late. And as soon as they had the opportunity to buy a family car, they just never travelled on the train at all. They might have done if they were commuting to work in London or another city, but the thought of getting on the train to go on your holidays by the mid-1960s, fewer and fewer people did so.
Not only was BR losing its public, but also their freight services were increasingly in decline as more goods were transported by road. British Railways ceased to be a profitable company.
Well, quite simply, what happened in 1948 to 55 is that British Rail began to lose money, that it began to register operating deficits, having not done so previously, and it was being challenged by road transport, both on the freight side and on the passenger side for the first time. And I think, therefore, that this is the origin of what was called the British Rail problem. And I think this informs attitudes to motive power. How can we get operating costs down? And one of the ways that one could do that was to replace steam with diesel.
After the war, it had not been seen as cost-effective to leave steam behind because coal was still cheap and plentiful. Within a few years, coal prices were on the rise and oil prices were dropping. The time had come to make the big switch to diesel power.
By the middle of the 1950s, it was becoming apparent that steam was not going to be easy to perpetuate. Several things were working against it. The price of coal was going up fairly dramatically. Of course, steam locomotives are messy things that tend to need maintenance 24 hours a day, and it was becoming more and more difficult to get people to work on them.
And in 1955, the British Transport Commission, which by that point had taken over all responsibility for strategic planning on the railway, announced a modernisation plan to spend really quite considerable amounts of capital for modernisation on the railways. A key element of the plan was the abolition of steam traction, because it was now felt that diesel traction had developed to the point where it was a viable technology, a workable technology, and also that there should be some large-scale electrification of Britain's main lines. So by the mid-1950s, it was widely recognised within the industry and outside the industry that steam traction was coming to the end of its useful life.
Steam overreached itself. The world moved on, and steam paid little heed to change. In the kingdom of the railways, diesel and electric have usurped the throne. The glory of steam is played out, finished, gone.
Despite the fact that nearly 2,000 standard and non-standard engines had been built by the mid-50s, the writing was on the wall for steam power.
British Railways were promised a new lease of life, a vast modernisation plan to be carried out over 15 years at a cost of more than £1,500 million. The days of the grand old steam locomotives were numbered. These sleek new giants began to take their place.
The transition from steam to newer forms of traction was not an altogether smooth one. And the result was, on the one hand, that the rate of withdrawal of steam traction increased. So steam locomotives were taken out of service more and more rapidly. But the new diesels often broke down. They were unreliable, or some kinds of them were unreliable. So quite often in the late 1950s, the early 1960s, British Railways was faced with the unenviable image of brand new diesel locomotives being hauled back, rescued, as it were, from breakdowns by the old-fashioned steam locomotive.
The passing of steam was happening. Even the railway enthusiast could see that the age of steam could not carry on.
The age of steam had to finish because it is an inefficient means of transportation. Burning coal to turn water into steam is very, very, very inefficient. It's dirty and it's manpower intensive, and I don't think it could have survived into the 21st century, even if they'd had the will to do so.
Steam was dirty, noisy and impractical. New diesels were clean, safe and quiet. For many of the people working on the trains every day, the end of steam could not come soon enough.
Bill, how do you like driving one of these new diesels?
Oh, I like them very much. I think they're a driver's dream, you know. I think it's vastly different altogether to the old steam engine, and much cleaner.
Do you get as much satisfaction out of the job as you did driving the old steam locos?
I think so, and as a matter of fact, now I'm used to it, I get more satisfaction. Why I say that is because with the old steam engine, with its faults and that, we did have some difficulty in maintaining the schedule when we got behind, but owing to the enormous amount of reserve power that we've got with these, we can pick up quite a lot of time and maintain an on-time schedule.
The modernisation plan had promised an end to steam-powered locomotives, but steam engines carried on being built for several years.
British Railways continued to make steam locomotives until 1960. The modernisation plan of 1955 had said that steam locomotives will eventually be eliminated, though it didn't give a time scale, and the steam locomotives that were being built into 1960 had essentially a useful life of between 25 and 30 years.
And it wasn't until March 1960 that the last steam locomotive was built for Britain's mainline railways. It was built at Swindon, and in a tradition of the Great Western Railway and Swindon Works of naming engines after the stars in the heavens, it was called, appropriately, Evening Star.
Evening Star was, in many ways, a normal steam engine, built to haul heavy freight and passenger trains. But the men who built and named her knew the significance she held. The ceremony to launch Evening Star was a sombre and poignant affair.
And you know, the incredible thing about Evening Star is, having been completed in 1960, it was out of service by 1965. 5 years' work. It just gives you an idea of almost the if not undue haste, certainly the ill-planned haste with which the transition to steam and diesel took place.
There was this assumption that steam would keep going until, say, the early or the mid-1970s. So it wasn't completely crackers to build Evening Star on that assumption. But what happens is, of course, you get this shift at the end of the 50s where they say, well, we've got to build diesels because they're going to be cheaper. And there's this momentum, you know, you can't just stop construction programs just like that. You know, the unions object, this kind of thing.
Perfectly good steam trains started to be taken off the railway and out of use forever. The locomotives and carriages were sent to scrapyards. But BR recognised the importance to the nation's heritage in some of these locomotive engines and decided to save a number of them for posterity.
British Railways produced a list of the 71 steam locomotives it felt ought to be preserved. That was a huge commitment because they weren't thinking about populating a whole network of heritage railways. Their perception was of static museums. I think it's a pretty long list rather than a short one when you consider what they were committing future generations to holding on to.
The list of 71 contained many well-known engines covering steam's long history. But most were from the previous century, ignoring the working locomotives known and loved by train spotters. Some enthusiasts were bound to be disappointed.
Well, I think we got together on the footbridge and we thought we better have a meeting about this. So we had this meeting, and because I'd got a typewriter, I said, well, I'll write a letter to the Railway magazine.
The letter called for donations from fellow enthusiasts to buy a 14XX steam engine from British Railways.
A couple of months went by, and I think, to be fair, we may have thought, oh well, it's not going to happen. But anyway, it was nice while it lasted. Yeah. And I was on holiday in the Lake District on a camping holiday, and my post was forwarded to me by my mother. And I opened up this envelope in the middle of the Lake District to find a £10 cheque in it from somebody subscribing to my appeal for the money to buy this engine. And I thought, goodness, what's happening now? What are we going to do now?
Yeah, what are we going to do now?
Within a few months, they had received enough money to buy the engine and begin restoring it.
Well, it's not looking so bad. Although, how many £100 did we have to pay for it now?
950?
No, 600. I think it was £690.
Well, there's certainly change out of 1,000.
And there's £50 delivery charge, I think. Dear me, so. But then we thought, where are we going to put it? That's the whole, who's got the biggest back garden,
The Southall boys were not alone in their crusade. Others were racing against the clock to preserve steam's heritage. The axing of trains and lines continued apace. The modernisation plan hadn't worked. The railways were losing more money than ever.
Well, from the mid-50s, things began to change. There was no fuel rationing affecting private motoring. Road transport began to get a great impetus from new road building, culminating in the first motorway, the M1, in 1959. It was a period of economic prosperity. It was important that the railways didn't fall behind, but one could say that they were already in a difficult position. Within the Ministry of Transport, there was a feeling that road transport was important to invest in because rail transport was declining. It was certainly losing market share.
The Beeching report of 1963 advocated the closure of money-losing regional lines and speeded up the changeover to diesel-powered trains.
Of course, some of you will say, well, what about all this modernisation? Can't we have the branch lines as well? Can't you attract enough traffic to them to make them pay? But unfortunately, we can't. We cannot make them pay because the traffic is not there and so many people have motor cars. The real question is whether you, as owners of the railways, want us to go on running these services at very high cost when the demand for them has very largely disappeared.
Steam was being withdrawn at a time when the nature of the railway itself was changing. The railway was now being seen by railway managers and many politicians alike as something which would become much more specialised. The railway would do what it could do best: fast intercity passenger trains, bulk freight trains. Yes, there was money for modernisation, but it was going to be modernisation, money spent on a much smaller railway system and a much more specialised railway system.
To reclaim the market being lost to private motoring, BR introduced a new and elite service. Naturally, the ultra-modern trains use diesel engines, not steam.
Luxury Pullmans provide one of the answers. Here's the first, introduced on the Manchester to London run. It's good but pricey. It's already called the expense account train. The coaches are air-conditioned and draft-proof. The food is excellent, all cooked in a spotless kitchen. And as it cruises along comfortably at an average speed of 90 miles an hour, it cocks a snook at the traffic on the M1.
Beeching regarded the electrification of the railway and the dieselification of the railway, if that's the word, he regarded it as simply the emblem of modernisation. The new Britain, the Britain of the 60s, had nothing to do with this filthy old technology. He also had to grapple with the fact that he was running steam engines on branch lines with no passengers. And the fact that people appeared to love them hadn't made them use them. So Beeching saw the end of steam as the advent of rationalism as well as of modernisation in British industry. He wasn't a railwayman himself, he was just sensible. And he realised this had to be the great battle. And he fought it and he won it.
The closure of underused branch lines upset and isolated rural communities. The final steam services could draw huge crowds as people came to lament the passing of an era.
Living appropriately in a station 14 months derelict, Miss Lawrence Aston, 35 years a railway worker, broods on the injustice of bureaucracy and the wrongs of the Great Western Railway. Were you here when the last train left?
Yes, I was.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was a long train with a big engine and crowded. Of course, they couldn't crowd it before, but it was the last trip. And to most of them, it was just a junketing, a party, an excuse to make a noise. But to me, it was like riding behind a hearse. It really was.
Throughout the country, throughout the 60s, steam was clinically removed from first railway sheds, but then from complete regions. So, for instance, the Western region, which covered an enormous area, was basically steam-free by the end of 1965.
And another one of the last 300 steam locomotives in service with British Railways comes to the end of the line, to its final resting place in a sidings which is becoming known as the graveyard of steam.
In 1 year alone, 500 locomotives, 4,000 coaches, 130,000 wagons and 250,000 tons of rail were destroyed without sentiment. David Shepherd is one of Britain's most well-known artists, who made his name painting wildlife. In 1967, he dropped everything to paint the last days of steam.
In my days as an artist, I had suddenly realised, like everybody else did in England who were interested in railways, that it was going and going fast. And through the eyes of a painter, I thought, I've got to do something about this. So I got involved with all the steam sheds, Nine Elms and Guildford particularly. And Nine Elms shed was more full of railway enthusiasts than it was of railwaymen. It was clamouring with railway enthusiasts trying to experience in one way or another the end of steam. And there was no control, and I felt sorry for BR because they were trying to run a railway while all this was going on. This one is actually one of my favourites in the sense that it's one of the toughest I did. 3 different angles of a circle, which is in itself bloody difficult. Wheels that way, boiler that way. But that's the most valuable part of this painting, and I don't believe you could get that colour sensitivity of colour in a photograph. And the dirt, it's lovely, much more exciting than a red buffer beam. I don't paint happy railway pictures. Shafts of sunlight coming through a soot-encrusted hole in the roof. Everything was falling apart. Little plays of light on the oil on the shed floor. People say, what's that white stripe? It's the light catching, the sunlight catching the edge of the inspection pit. And, you know, you had to go in and see it to do that. I mean, it would never have occurred to me. Oh, happy days, wonderful days. The sheer hell of doing it, I mean, it was, oh God, I mean, in the painting I did of Wilson sheds, the snow was coming through the roof, and it was black by the time it hit the ground. The main thing was I was trying to record the last days of steam through the eyes of an artist rather than a photographer. It's the colours that were interesting, not the shape of the wheels. That didn't matter, because the camera did that. And that's why those sketches are so valuable to me. They're not worth any money particularly, but they're irreplaceable to me because they've done in the heat of the moment, in the dying days of steam. One of my many rushed visits to Guildford Shed, just down the road from where we lived, just at the right moment when I came in and I saw this logo half in the sun and half in the shadow, just by chance, and I thought, what an opportunity with the subtle colours on a dirty engine in the sun and in the shade. And also I noticed where they'd cleaned the number around so that they could at least identify the number of the engine, otherwise that would have been invisible like everything else. I think it was premature urge to, of necessity, go into diesels and electrics. I mean, steam could have lasted longer, but it could have done, but it wouldn't have done because you wouldn't get the people to put up with it now, all the dirt and everything that I've described. People don't want to get filthy dirty when they go to London or anywhere else for that matter. So it would have died and it had to die, but it was just disgusting the way it went out. Get rid of it, filthy. And we should have been proud of our steam age.
As the engines were removed, jobs went too. Some of the men who operated them, the drivers and the firemen, were retained, but many found themselves redundant, skilled in a job that belonged in the last century.
Most of the drivers actually went to Oxford to work, but I think nearly all the firemen left. Yeah, it was a sad day, but it's, you know, nothing we could do about it. When it closed, I started working on building sites, you know, and whatever jobs you could get, because you end up with what you thought you were a skilled man. When you was a fireman, you found you had no skills whatsoever.
Steam needed to come to an end. I suppose the issue is, did it need to come to an end in 1968? The answer is probably no. There was a determined assault on steam locomotion in the Beeching period. Having been slower than many European countries to phase out steam, we suddenly embarked on a headlong rush to get rid of steam from 1963 to 1968. And I think that was unfortunate because I think the diesel alternative wasn't always there.
I mean, you've got to understand that when you go from steam to diesel, you've got to go overnight. I mean, you've got to stop all your coaling plants, you've got to stop all your water points, you've got to retrain all the drivers. It's crazy to run a double system. And Beeching's genius was he realised that. He'd got to retrain all his drivers at one go. You'd got to abandon steam. You couldn't let it dribble on. I mean, it did dribble on in various areas of the country. But essentially, the conversion of a railway from one form of locomotion to another has to be overnight, or you're doubling everything, and that's very, very expensive.
On the 11th of August 1968, the fires were lit for the final passenger train to be pulled by steam on the main line.
It was known as the 15 guinea special because a ticket to ride that train cost 15 guineas. And it was a train that went from Liverpool to Manchester, then to Hellifield and over the Settle Carlisle line to Carlisle. And it was pulled by two types of engine, one type called the Black 5, which ended up being the major workhorse at the end of steam. And the last express passenger engine, which was a Pacific called Oliver Cromwell.
But 1968 was not the end of steam. Though most engines lay rusting in scrapyards, a steam revival lay ahead. And the centre of that resurrection was a scrapyard in Barry in Wales, where many of the engines had been sent.
All the way through the 1950s and 60s, when steam was being run down, the scrapyards of Britain were buzzing with gas axes because they had a lot of engines to get through, and steam engines are made of very thick steel. Now, one of the scrapyards was called Barry Scrapyard, and it was owned by a guy called Di Woodham, who got, I think, approaching 200 engines into his yard, but at the time was cutting up wagons and coaches, had enough of those to be getting on with.
The government announced that there was to be a £250 million programme to modernise British Rail, and I thought, well, that's a gravy train, I've got to get on it.
And by the time the end of the 60s came along, preservation societies that had been set up after the end of steam were beginning to have enough money to buy individual engines. And Barry Scrapyard was the last scrapyard where they were left in any number. So suddenly Di was getting phone calls from preservation societies saying, can we buy that engine back from you, we want to restore it. And, Di obviously was going to make a few quid out of that, probably a bit more than scrap value. So he went, yeah, and it saved him the trouble of having to cut them up. And over a sort of 25-year period, every single engine in that yard was bought by a preservation society. It's without Barry Scrapyard, actually, the preservation industry wouldn't be nearly as big because there just wouldn't be enough engines to run on it.
I had my easel in Barry Scrapyard. That engine will be probably running now on a preserved railway. And look, the boiler cladding had burst open. White asbestos, we were chucking it about. Terrifying to think what we were doing in those days. But what an end to a steam engine. But she was saved by someone.
David Shepherd didn't just paint the steam engines that he loved. He bought several locomotives and began the long process of restoring them.
Real old-timer, look at this thing here. It's rather pathetic when you think about it, because these things live, don't they? Compared with a diesel, they have life. Something's got to be done, We'll have to save some of these.
And I went round to their office. Their office was in a guard's van body next to his Rolls Royce. The whole thing was so funny, his Rolls Royce covered in oil, and just marvellous. And I said, I've come for some spares. And he said, OK, well, if you're fair and you treat us properly, take what you want. And we borrowed their oxyacetylene. But for £110, I think I got a whole set of coupling rods and a mechanical lubricator, which would cost thousands to build down. He said, what have you got in the back of your stay car? And I said, well, I got a mechanical lubricator. What's that? He didn't know what it was. It was just money to him. And he gave it a push and he said 12 and 6. So I gave him a quid and he gave us the change. I mean, those days were unreal.
This particular example, which is pretty rough, but I forecast that when the preservationists have finished with it, she'll be like the day she was built. Magic. Pure magic.
I mean, steam hasn't come to an end. It was the beginning of the enthusiast railways, and really that is a tremendous story in its own right.
It's a story that over the last 40 years has grown to include over 100 separate heritage railways, with 1,300 working steam locomotives. 6 million visitors annually is proof that the public are still in love with steam.
Have your tickets ready, please?
Certainly, railway enthusiasm in Great Britain it's an industry now. It's huge. Literally millions of people travel on preserved lines or preserved steam trains every weekend. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are members of a society or at least part of the wider circle of steam preservation societies in this country. It is huge.
These are extraordinary enterprises, really. These are essentially amateurs, railway enthusiasts in the best sense of that word. People who are seeing part of British life disappearing and who decide to do something about it, to preserve it in some shape or form, and to use their own time, their own money, their own energy to do precisely that. And they succeed.
One of the biggest success stories in railway preservation is the Great Western Society, based at Didcot, and started by the Southall boys.
And money was still coming in. Yeah. We bought the engine, we bought the coach, and we then, I suppose, started getting greedy. We're saying, well, what else should we do? But in the end, it began to not only engines and coaches. It was the artefacts, as you were saying, you know, that people began to collect and forward onto us or steer us in the direction of, you know.
The Southall boys gradually assembled one of the finest railway collections in the world. 24 steam locomotives stand alongside more than 80 wagons and coaches, and even signal boxes. The Great Western Society is now the second biggest tourist attraction in Oxfordshire.
No, different bell codes, different means of operation.
But then again, you'd think that this box has been here forever.
The love of steam is no longer confined to looking back at the past. It's the 1st of August, 2008 in Darlington. After 18 years and funded by private donations to the tune of £3 million, the brand new A1 class Tornado is finally ready to be launched.
Well, so for me, it's a culmination of a lifetime's ambition. When I was at school and bored, I used to draw steam locomotives like this in my rough book. And subsequently, I've worked on restoring them, building models of them, and the chance to actually build a full-size one here in 2008, me at the age of 57, I just find it unbelievable. It's really a great privilege, and I'm very pleased to have had this chance and to have had all the support that we've had to enable it to happen.
It's the 40th anniversary of the end of steam.
Ran on a main line in this country. But with the launch of Tornado, steam has again found a new lease of life.
It's good, it's working, it's doing what it's supposed to do, and hopefully she's putting on a good show for the crowd. I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up at the moment, and the eyes are moistening.